Roll for Crit is made possible thanks to the support of viewers like you and our patrons on our Patreon page.
You can become a patron for just $1 a month at patreon.com/rollforcrit. Welcome to Roll for Crit. This is our preview for the board game Frostpunk, which will be launching on Kickstarter in October. It is based on the Frostpunk video game. This comes from a brand new studio, Glass Cannon Unplugged, but it is not a team of people who are new to the board game industry. This was designed by the designer of Nemesis, and it's also being worked on by the same team who brought us the board game adaptation of This War of Mine, which was from the same designer of Frostpunk. So appropriately, they're tackling this one next. This is a post-apocalyptic setting. An ice age has hit the planet, and you must manage your city, manage your citizens, and survive.
This game is all about placing your workers wisely in order to make sure that they are doing the right moves and maybe the right sacrifices. The game will look like this, where you'll be placing tiles around the iconic tower from Frostpunk. This is generating the heat you will need to survive. If you look over to the left of the board here, you'll see a heat track, and it tells you what parts of the board it is heating up, whether it is the exact center, the inner ring, or the outer ring. This will be important later on. We can't show in the digital version, but in the physical one, the tower will actually be sort of like a dice tower where you'll be putting cubes in, and depending on what comes out, well, we'll tell you what happens about that a little bit later. Now, there will be a scenario chosen at the beginning. It'll have you make either choices or maybe require you to build certain things. You're going to be starting off by an event card in the morning, which will, of course, have a whole bag of fun things for you to do. Then there will be dealing with your population. Now, each round, you'll be focusing on a specific kind of your citizens. There are 3 kinds: workers, children, and engineer. And depending on the round, those are the ones you're going to have to be worrying about when it comes to population. You'll also need to be worrying about sickness. That will spread among your population depending on how well you're able to handle them. Each group, like before, has their own sick token, and depending on how far they are, they could just be spreading some sickness or becoming deathly sick. If they become deathly sick too often, you'll start killing off your people, and you'll have to draw from this corpse bag, which makes you lose hope. Hope and discontent are one of the major tracks in this game. There are different kinds of hope and discontent, but overall, losing one means putting one away in the bag, gaining one is adding one to the track, or possibly flipping it over to its stronger side. There could be cards that say if you have care or justice available, you'll get a bonus. Or if you have greed available, you'll get more punishments. So that is a major thing to keep track of. Also, if you lose too much hope or gain too much discontent, you can just straight up lose the game. Probably something you want to avoid.
Yes, all those things, the hope and the discontent, your hunger, your sickness, you're going to need to have all that stuff in the back of your mind. But the core of the game is really taking your meeples and placing them where they need to go. So there's a variety of things that they can do in order to help you increase your population, keep everybody healthy and safe. Obviously, you've got this big area in the center here made up of hexes. That is your main city surrounding your big old tower, as we mentioned. And one of the most obvious things that you can do that's very, very helpful is to have your meeples go out and explore the area surrounding that. So there are different tiles, and those different tiles represent the inner or further outer rings of the area. And depending on what you're doing, you could reveal 2 inner ring tiles or just one of the outer ring. New tiles will have new resources for you to make use of, and they will also serve as spaces for new buildings. You're going to start with some buildings and build more as you go, and that's another thing you can do with your meeples. You can place them onto those buildings to take different actions. For example, you could send someone to the hunter's hut to go out and gather food and increase your food track. You could go to the medic post to heal some of the sickness that your people might be suffering from, or to the gathering post, which allows you to gather resources from surrounding tiles. You can also take a basic gathering action. If you send someone to a hex that just has some resources on it, they can collect 2 of those resources and put them into your shared supply for your group to be spent later on. Another important building you might want to visit is the platform. Here you can declare new laws. So that's a big aspect of this game. You can decide what things should or shouldn't become laws, and you will have a variety of options at the beginning of the game, some fixed, some randomly dealt out, so each time there will be some different choices. And some of them may provide moral dilemmas. They will have consequences, whether they be good or bad, short term or long term. For example, child labor is a big one. You can use your children meeples and send those out to do certain jobs for you. But whether you decide to allow that or disallow it, you're going to have a consequence card added to your dusk deck. And later on, you may discover that as a result of having kids go out to work, one of them fell sick or died. So laws are something that as a group you really want to discuss and make sure you're on the same page about before you proceed with anything. You can also build new buildings. Those will cost wood. You spend the wood that they cost and you add that building to an empty space of the board. If it has some resources in it, you will lose those resources. So that's something to keep in mind. And there's all kinds of new buildings you can add to your board. You might want to build bunkhouses, for example, that will allow you to keep more people warm at night, or some of the other ones that I mentioned previously. You've also got these expeditions. If you go out on an expedition, you send someone onto this card, and later on in the round, you will learn exactly how far along that expedition they got, and they may find some rewards at the end of it. It might also be something that you're trying to do for your specific scenario. For any of these actions, you have to keep in mind whether or not a given space is heated. So you've got to refer back to that generator and if you have spent enough coal to power it, because if you send someone to do a job in an unheated space, your sickness track will increase a little bit. In fact, for exploring, that's always an unheated action because you're going out into the unknown and it's very cold out there. So it's something that's necessary, but it will result in a slightly negative effect. Once you have run out of meeples for the round, you're finished taking your actions, then you go to the dusk phase, you draw one of those cards, find out what happens to you. It may affect your hope or discontent or have some other effect depending on what you've been doing before. Maybe a card will come back that you've already seen, or maybe a card will be removed and you won't have to worry about it anymore. Then you've got the hunger phase. You have to feed your citizens according to the hunger track, and if you are unable to do so, that may result in some negative effects. And finally, the night phase, you have to house everybody, so you need to have enough warm spaces for all of your meeples. That's a reason you might want to be building those bunkhouses. If you're unable to, anyone who is left out in the cold is going to get sick.
Now, it sounds like we went over a lot of ground here, and there is a lot to do in this game. We didn't mention every single little thing. But the truth is, once you start playing it, a lot of the actions just sort of make sense. For example, you're thinking like, okay, I need food. What do I need to do to get food? I'm cold because it's snowing, so I need to heat. Like, it's the kind of things you sort of would already be thinking about, and you get into a groove of how to place your workers and stuff. The real fun, a lot of it comes down to the choices you have to make. Like this Warbind, you're going to have to make decisions like, is it worth for me to get for the food to get enough to feed people? But then I'm sacrificing shelters. Maybe I really need that heat, or, maybe I just let that outer ring stay because I won't send anyone out there this round. And then, of course, there are those laws, like the child labor is an obvious early example of one. And there are multiple different events and consequences for which decision you try to make. It's the kind of game that's, I think, very fun to play with someone else and then argue about these things to see which one you decide to go with.
Yes, a lot of those ethical, moral quandaries will pop up at you in this game. Another one is the choice to add sawdust to your food so you can feed more people, but maybe it's not so good. Maybe they won't be so happy about eating sawdust. And a lot of it is like, do you want that short-term bonus? Will that be enough to get you through what you need to get through? But maybe it'll be worse in the long term. You don't really know all the time. You can have different consequences based on different laws, and even the thing that seems like the right decision at the time might turn out not to be so great later on. It's a lot of that kind of thing that will really provoke interesting discussions between players. This is a game that I think, similar to this War of Mine, will shine a lot as a solo game. And in co-op, it goes up to 4 players. So you got to figure out as a group how that works and how much you're willing to fight with each other over these kinds of things. But I also want to say, like what you were saying about how much stuff that we really covered, and there are a lot of tracks and there are
Hmm.
a lot of resources and stuff you have to be mindful of that I feel like, because it's based on a video game. In the digital version, a lot of that stuff is more manageable because it's you just clicking rather than moving physical components. But most of that stuff is all like these upkeep phases, and it kind of walks you through it in a way that's like, well, I know this happened, so now I have to do this and do this. You're like checking things off a list. It's really in that main phase where you're taking those actions that, like you said, it's pretty straightforward. It all makes sense. And once you're informed about those background things, they'll help you make those decisions and make you'll eventually start to realize, oh, I know that our hope is really important. And I know if I do this, that's going to lead to this other thing that will increase our hope. So that's what we should be focusing on. And it does start to flow in a way that makes sense.
And the round tracker, I think, is interesting because it's not simply just tracking the rounds and when you hit certain points, because it tells you, okay, for these rounds, you only care about the children or the engineers. This game is also about planning about that, because what if you really needed to place all the workers away because you had a lot of workers? You're like, this is the time maybe to get that law that has you fit more people in shelters because you really needed this round. Or if
Mm-hmm.
it's the child round where there's usually not as many people in population, maybe you can ignore that. So it's really about planning around that too. It's not simply just dealing with that. And there's also a storm that can hit, which will actually freeze some buildings. So then it's like, do I build the cheaper building, but it's worthless in possibly about a few rounds? Or do I go for the more expensive one, which I could probably outlast the storm with?
Yeah, from what we've played, which is not a ton and only in this digital version, it seems like it strikes a really nice balance between the thematic, again, moral questions and feeling good or bad about what you're doing at any given time and worrying about the health and hunger of your citizens with being mechanically a very robust survival game and having to decide when should we go out and explore, where should we explore, what should we spend our limited resources on. We only have so much wood. Which buildings are our priority for this turn? Do we house everybody or do we feed everybody? And I think that the marriage of the two things, the theme and mechanics, is done really nicely because unlike some games where I feel like sometimes those feel like two separate issues, in this one, they're going to come together in a nice way. And if you decide to let children work, that gives you more workers for the round. You have more meeples, more actions that you can take. But there's a dark side to that, and it doesn't feel disconnected at all. It feels like those two things really are feeding off of each other.
And we only got to see one main scenario in some of the laws. I'm sure there's going to be a lot more in the base game. So with this alone, we already were very intrigued, and just like I think this War Mind both got into arguing about some of these moral dilemmas and what's worth it or not, what situations, and also not even just that, how to plan things. Do we think we can get away with this? Like if we flip over a tile and we can get this resource, I think we'll have enough to, be able to build this and stuff. And if we don't, then we'll have to sacrifice then something else. And I think that
Mm-hmm.
kind of strategizing in the game has a lot of information, but that information is there so you can plan out your rounds pretty well.
Yeah, very little luck. I think that there's a bit of randomness in what cards might come up, but most of the time, based on what your past decisions were, you can kind of start to guess what might happen in the future. The biggest thing I think is that big dice tower, which you don't know exactly how many cubes are gonna fall out, but it makes sense, I think, and it's something that you'll want to be wary of and prepared for anyway.
Those cubes, by the way, represents malfunctions if they come out, and obviously if too many build up, the thing explodes and you die. But there is a way for you to repair them, and which is very nice. And that's also a good way of like, can we get away with? Do we think too many cubes are going to fall out this next round because how many were put in there?
The team behind the game we got to talk to compared it a little bit to Robinson Crusoe, and I think that's spot on. If you like Robinson Crusoe, This is absolutely one to take a look at. It's like Robinson Crusoe, but
Cold.
without dice and cold, and way more feeling terrible about your horrible decisions that you're making and ethical dilemmas that you have to face.
All right, kidding me? I feel fine with my steaks. Would you like a bite?
No, thank you. I don't know what's in that, but I'm not eating it. I'm good. I'll sleep out in the cold tonight. So it is Frostpunk, and I'm sure there are fans of the video game out there who are going to be excited to try this one out. I think it's a really fascinating adaptation, and we're definitely excited to see the final product. Again, it's going to be on Kickstarter in October. You can check our description down below for a link to that, and once it launches, you can take a look and see if you want to back it for yourself. But we definitely like to hear from you in the comments section about what you think. Have you played Frostpunk? Have you played this War of Mine, the board game? What are your expectations for this new adaptation? And do you or do you not support putting sawdust into our food?
You can let us know in those comments down below. But until then, I'm Will.
I'm Jonathan.
And this has been a Roll for Crit preview. If you want to help out, you can check out our Patreon, or a simple click to like and subscribe can go a long way.
We really appreciate everything that you can do for us. We love you.